So yeah.
Okay. Great stuff. Listen, thanks to everybody for joining us again for our Rural Voices series via the NUI Galway Rural Studies Centre and the Department of Rural and Community Development as well, who are partnering with us on the Rural Voices seminar series. So this is our 5th seminar series, and we're delighted today to invite and to have with us Dr. Karen Keaveney and Kramer, and they will present on a current project that they are involved in called InPLACE. So in a couple of minutes, I'll allow them to explain all of that to you, but just maybe to give you a little bit of an idea about Karen and Caroline. So Karen is the head of rural development and an assistant professor in the School of Agricultural and Food Science in University College in Dublin. And previously, Karen was a lecturer in the rural spatial planning in Queen's University in Belfast, and she has held a number of visiting appointments internationally, including a visiting research fellowship in the Joint Centre for Housing Studies in Harvard University and visiting professor in the Department of Geography, University of Toronto. So well internationally connected, Karen. And she's also a qualified urban and regional planner and via UCD, and she's an undergraduate degree in human and physical geography via NUIG, and her PhD is via Maynooth. And in moving acrossways to Maynooth, we have Caroline Kramer, and Caroline is the Director of International Centre for Local and Regional Development. And Caroline is also a qualified planner and a qualified town planner, and also a research fellow with Maynooth University Social Institute. And she has, I think, for the past 20 years worked in research and management capacity on a number of EU funded projects focused on urban and rural regeneration, spatial planning, multi-level governance and community participation. So we have two very highly qualified and well-connected speakers with us today to talk to us about their InPLACE project. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Karen and Caroline to give us today's presentation. Again, thank you all for coming. And of course, needless to say, if you could keep your mics muted during the presentation, that would be really good. It just stops any interference. So thanks a million for doing that. So I'm going to hand it over to Karen and to Caroline.
Thanks very much, Maura. So I'm going to take the floor first. So I'll just get my screen sharing here. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, we have that, Caroline.
Fantastic. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and very much thank you to the Rural Voices series for the opportunity to present the ongoing InPLACE research program to you today, and also to you, Maura, and your colleagues for the very warm welcome. So as Maura said, my name is Caroline Kramer, and I'm the Director of the International Centre for Local and Regional Development, the ICLRD. And together with my colleague Karen, today we look forward to sharing our initial and emerging findings from phase 1 of the InPLACE study. We are 2 members of a larger team working on InPLACE, all of whom have contributed towards today's presentation, and some of whom you will be meeting shortly. In terms of the presentation outline today, this afternoon's presentation will cover the genesis of InPLACE. We'll examine the phenomenon that is commuting as an evolving narrative, and we'll consider the impacts of commuting on place and place-based communities. And in taking this place-based perspective, it will address a gap in research focused on commuting, and particularly in an Irish context. From our research and fieldwork to date on commuting and its impacts and drivers, housing and transport are 2 issues that continually come up. And for the purposes of this presentation and today, we're going to focus in on housing. And finally, we'll pull together some emerging conclusions, noting, of course, that this programme has still another year to run. But firstly, if I may, a few words on ICLRD. So ICLRD is a network of academic institutes located in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the US, and with affiliations also in UK and Germany. We were brokered by the North-South Ministerial Council, largely as a response to the Good Friday Agreement and a burning question of what role for local government in building peace and reconciliation on the island, and specifically within that, the role of spatial planning. So we were formally constituted in 2006 as an honest broker, where we play a key role in bridging the policy praxis divide and being responsive to the needs of policymakers, particularly at local government level. So ICLRD works to a number of strategic goals and work streams, from promoting multidisciplinary research activities, both applied and action-orientated, to developing bespoke capacity building programs for public officials, civic leaders, non-governmental and other practitioners involved in local, regional and national development, to fostering collaboration, to facilitating network building, all with local government communities, with a particular emphasis then on translating policy into on-the-ground action. And for further information on the organisation, please feel free to visit our website, www.iclrd.org. Right, so into InPLACE. So the genesis of InPLACE goes back to 2019, when we received an email from a resident of the town of Newtown Kennedy in County Wicklow, where they expressed concern about the impact of commuting on both place and the overall well-being of the community, and asking if ICLRD would consider undertaking some action research into this phenomenon of commuting, particularly during the economic boom years of the mid-1990s to mid-2000s, when commuting largely reshaped both our suburban and our rural locations as the commuter belt expanded further and further out, leading to increasing commuter volumes, distances and travel times. So this email struck a chord with ICLRD, and we set about developing a research proposal that not only considered this phenomenon in Newtown Kennedy, but also across the island of Ireland, and to identify then a funding source to support us to carry out this research. And just as we were commencing those discussions with potential funders, COVID-19 was to become a major disruptor in all our lives, including dramatically changing the activity patterns of individuals and families, transforming everyday geographies and also the scale at which we lived our lives. It was immediately obvious to us that we needed to rework our proposal so that it covered the impacts of commuting pre, during, and indeed now as we move into phase 2 of our study, post the pandemic. It is important to know that this 2-year research program is only possible because of the consortium of funders who recognized the value added and timeliness of this research, and thus enabled ICLRD to pull an international multidisciplinary team together. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to particularly thank the Office of the Planning Regulator, the Local Government Management Agency, the Department of Housing, Local Government Heritage, the Department for Infrastructure NI, Clare County Council, and the Maryland Department of Transportation. So meet the team. So our team draws from a number of ICLRD's partners and affiliate partners, namely Maynooth University, Ulster University, and our colleague, Dr. Gavin Rafferty, UCD from Karen, Mary Immaculate College, Professor Des McCafferty, who is actually the PI for this study, and our team for University of Maryland, which is Professor Garrett Knapp, Jesse Bartley, and Nick Finio. And then our wonderful data analyst, Dominic Robinson, who's working with us as a research assistant. So our team is a mix of spatial planners, geographers, economists, and data analysts, with a diverse range of research interests in areas such as regional and rural development, urbanization, smart growth, resilience, well-being, housing, transport, governance, statistical analysis, and data visualization. We have two main research aims. Our primary objective is to investigate the impact of out-commuting, especially long-duration out-commuting, on place and communities of place, using a case study approach. And secondary to this, to examine the impact on commuter settlements of the changing relationship between home and work, pre, during, and post the pandemic. And in terms of the case study approach, we're doing this program under two phases. Phase one, I suppose firstly, across both phases, we're using a case study approach, where all towns are similar in terms of population size and also their socioeconomic characterizations, and all rural, because we feel that it is at this scale that will enable us to clearly draw out the effects of long duration out commuting on place. Critically, all towns experience high levels of out commuting that exceed 45 minutes in duration one way. And I'll come back momentarily to the significance of that. With phase one focusing on 3 case study towns, these towns were selected using a range of different criteria as outlined on the slide. Information drawn from census, but also through discussions we held with a range of regional stakeholders, from government departments to local community development groups. And this was in part an acknowledgement of the datedness of the data that we were relying on, and recognizing that we needed to supplement that then with some on the ground knowledge to really understand where was being impacted by commuting. So our 3 towns in phase one were Newtown Mount Kennedy in County Wicklow, under the influence of the Greater Dublin commuter belt, and which was, I suppose, in many respects, the genesis and birthplace of this programme. Dundrum in County Down, which is under the influence primarily of the Greater Dublin commuter belt. And then our 3rd town is Ennistimon-Lahinch, while similar in scale, is unlike the previous 2 settlements in that it is characterised by low out commuting. And by including a low out commuting town, it is expected that its detailed examination alongside the other case study areas will allow a clearer identification of the effects of out commuting. And conversely, the dividend to communities of having that lower separation between place of residence vis-a-vis place of work. For phase 2, which will commence in the autumn, we will focus on a further 4 case study towns, a number of which have yet to be identified, but we know what counties we'll be working in. And those counties are County Galway, County Kildare, County Cork, and County Antrim, with Ennistimon-Lahinch once again remaining our low commuting town for this phase of the study. So commuting is a core part of this study, and understanding I suppose the evolving narrative of commuting, but also then very much its impact on place. So a key part of the programme has been, of course, a detailed literature review and policy analysis, and that's taking place sort of very much at the outset of the programme, and in parallel to that also the census analysis and the story mapping, which Karen will touch upon shortly. But in terms of the literature review, it's very clear that over the last century, spatial changes in the way that work is organised and distributed in relation to housing markets has led to a growth in commuting. And as a phenomenon, and we have previously mentioned the impacts of the economic boom, commuting times are as a result longer and have increased more dramatically, particularly in the counties around Dublin. And commuting has become an intrinsic behaviour of modern life, impacting on place, how place evolves, and actually how we even use place. It represents an interplay between labour and housing markets, and thus expanding the geographies of work to home, demanding people's valuable time, and therefore generating conflicting schedules between time spent travelling and pursuing other activities. People are making difficult trade-offs between access to affordable housing, access to a home to own, income, and indeed loss of spare time. In terms of impacts on communities of place, there's a growing literature around the harms that commutes have on well-being and subjective well-being, with studies also pointing to how increased commute times are associated with a decrease in physical activity, how commuting by car causes more stress. So at the moment, we're kind of looking at all of this and trying to understand how this impacts both on place, the evolution of place, how we use place, and indeed then on communities themselves. I mentioned earlier that a critical factor for our town selection was this 45-minute commute duration. And the reason that we are using that is that there's research out there that points to 45 minutes or greater being the bearable commute. Anything after 45 minutes, we start to tip into a completely different scenario. I suppose looking then at trends in commuting, a census of population returns indicate that in almost every intercensal period, with the exception of the financial crash, there has been a recorded increase in travel to work times. Between 2011 and 16, for example, which is the latest data available to us, of the 144,000 reporting a travel time, almost half recorded commutes of over 45 minutes. And in 2016, also recording an increase in those who had to leave home before 7 a.m. to make it to work. And yet then when we look at then what the effects of COVID-19 were, talk about a picture, or in this instance, a graph, painting 1,000 words in terms of illustrating the disruption to car-based commuting as a result of COVID-19. The visual is stark, with the various lockdowns clearly identifiable. In the yellowish line representing 2021, when we started to see a lift downs out of, just a bit of disruption there, the lockdowns being lifted and a return to work, we can see the commuting trends starting to rise again. So particularly as we move into phase 2, we're particularly interested to see how that is progressing and what the kind of models of future work are starting to emerge. To help us, I suppose, disaggregate and consider the impact of commuting on place, we're using a particular tool, and this is the place standard. So the COVID-induced interruption to what seemed an inexorable trend towards ever increasing commuting, no questions asked, created an opportunity for us to plug a gap in Irish research in terms of what are the implications of commuting on place and place-based communities. Questions raised by COVID about the relationships between commuting and community have assumed increasing significance. And to help us to begin to answer these questions in a context where the impact of COVID-19 on that relationship between home and work, and consequently on communities and place, is only beginning to be understood, we turn to the place standard tool to aid us. And for those of you not familiar with the place standard tool, this was developed jointly by NHS Health Scotland, the Scottish Government, and Architecture and Design Scotland as a simple framework to structure conversations about place. It allows us to think about the various elements of a place, physically, socially, and environmentally, and it provides a mechanism for ensuring that the views, stories, and real-life experiences of people living in a particular place are captured, valued, and importantly, integrated into the heart of decision-making processes. For us to understand the implications of commuting on place, we first need to understand the dynamics of place. And the place standard tool is therefore embedded quite deeply into our methodological framework. And that methodological framework is mixed methods, using both qualitative and quantitative data. In each town under phase 1, an online survey is employed, and that survey is still currently open across all 3 towns, and currently has garnered over 300 responses. This in turn then is being supported by an ethnographic approach involving both semi-structured interviews and focus groups. And what we are starting to see from both the survey and the interviews is that when respondents had the opportunity to answer qualitatively, housing and transport were 2 key issues that continually arose. In both Newtown Mount Kennedy and Ennistimon-Lahinch, for example, housing and homes came up in over 86% of the interviews held there, with other key related issues to housing, including affordability, planning, access to supply, and remote working, and the implications of remote working. And this provides, I suppose, a very opportune segue to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Karen Keaveney, who just happens to be a leading expert on rural housing across the island of Ireland. And so they're very much the right person now to lead us through the next section of today's presentation.
Thanks, Karen. Don't build me up too much. Thank you. So we're back here to the PLACE standard tool, and these are actually the results, our preliminary results from the 3 surveys that have been conducted so far that Caroline has outlined. And what really struck us here was that while there was lots of different scoring around different areas, you can see actually people are really satisfied, for example, with the natural environment, with where they live. Housing kind of bucked the trend a little bit. It was low on one side. And then if you want to just click Caroline there once, and you can see there that in green we have Ennistimon-Lahinch, and that scored around a 3 point with Dundrum and Newtown Mount Kennedy scoring 4. So housing was one of the least satisfactory areas, and you can see also transport up there as well. So next slide.
Sorry, Karen, I just seem to have frozen.
You're okay. I can kind of start talking around it anyway. So with the just focusing really, and the rest of the presentation is really focusing on housing and really looking at the impacts and relationships between commuting and housing. And there are a number of studies around this area. Thanks, Caroline, I can see it now. This is the joys of trying to do it at distance. So Fingaton et al. Really highlight the environmental aspect to affordability. We tend to look at affordability as a socioeconomic issue, but of course there's an environmental aspect, because if housing becomes largely unaffordable where people work, then high volumes of commuting are likely to occur. It's a natural response. I think we all know ourselves, be it personally or anecdotally, the choice that people make to move to afford a house. So the daily ebb and flow of commuters from more affordable locations to employment centres has a costly financial impact on the individual households, but also on local and global environments. That's really, really significant. And it's an interesting time given obviously the decrease in travel that we saw for some people during COVID. It's obviously going back to other levels, and we've changed how we commute since we're in this stage of the pandemic. So research on the immediate impacts of COVID highlight the opportunity for some with jobs amenable to remote working to move to locations where they possibly are originally from, or to a location where house prices are more affordable. COVID has starkly highlighted the inequity across society globally and within regions. And for many, the opportunity to move, to gain from a lower cost of living outside cities is really a part of a longer term structural issue in housing and economies. And Ireland clearly has that issue. On the other side, kind of can't talk about housing without bringing up planning. And that's always an issue that we see, particularly in rural areas. But from other studies, particularly Inch and Shepherd, they identify really that relationship between housing development, really draws attention to planning as a space for an ideological struggle. And we're really seeing that, particularly as a new rural housing guideline is imminent this year. And finally, in a Norwegian study, Nordahl examined what she called the market periphery. And that was identifying groups that are victims of high barriers to urban housing markets. And that really has knock-on effects for those living or choosing to live or having to move to outer rural or rural town settings. Next slide, please. I was going to change it myself and forgot. So from a policy point of view, nationally and regionally, there is, particularly from a regional development point of view, a drive to divert growth from larger urban centres outwards. And there are obstacles in achieving some of these aims of the National Planning Framework. Around, there is the goal for balanced regional development, for compact growth in cities and towns, policy desire and push for greater use of public transport, and obviously a reduction in carbon emissions. But sometimes this is at odds with that idea of commuting, where we do see high reliance on car usage, particularly outside the Greater Dublin area and other large cities. Locally, there's major issues for people commuting as well. Quality of life issues for commuters and their families, and quality of place, of course, which is a major focus for us. And that really arises from housing and traffic issues, from what actually the local economy provides and needs, the strength of community and social capital, and sense of place in these local areas. Next slide. So just drawing on some of the policy frameworks that we have here, the National Planning Framework, when it draws out housing and particularly rural housing under National Policy Objective 19, commuting is highlighted here in the NPF, and really it talks about the catchments of cities and large towns and centres of employment. But the focus then, when we kind of drill down into Policy Objective 19, is really looking at that ongoing kind of political football that is one-off single housing. And really that's the focus of that. It's not, it doesn't seem to be linking commuting with towns. It seems to be linking it mainly with one-off housing in the policy framework. In the next slide, we have our more recent rural policy, our rural future, and they are in that policy at least attempting to incentivize people to move into town centres, so through refurbishment of vacant buildings in towns. And a report came out yesterday on that. And also there's obviously an encouragement for remote workers to relocate to rural towns, particularly under Policy Measure 90. That update of the rural housing guidelines is central. But I suppose what I'm going to look at in the next few slides is really trying to set the context for some of this, because one-off housing is one of those things that we tend to focus on in rural housing, and we tend to talk about a lot of things when it comes to housing outside of cities, really. So we tend to differentiate between urban and rural housing as if they were part of different systems, and it's all part of one national system that impacts each other. There's a tendency to focus on single dwellings or one-off housing, when really they are just part of the picture of how we live and work in the countryside. There's an emotional side to rural housing when we talk about rights and traditions and cultural heritage. There's the language around cheaper houses, and I very deliberately use that word, of this perception of it's cheaper. Commuting is obviously always talked about with housing, and remote work now has come into our everyday vernacular. We then see on the next slide, there's, just to highlight some of those headlines that we're all too familiar with. And these are more recent headlines because of the imminency of the rural housing guidelines that are meant to be coming out. Really I've just used those to highlight the emotion that we have and the politicization that surrounds living in the countryside. And really it's to highlight that, yes, that in of itself is interesting and important, but it links into a broader system of where people are working, how they're connecting to other places, and all the other implications. A house does not just happen in a vacuum. On the next slide, really, I look at what we don't tend to talk about when we talk about rural housing. We don't tend to talk, or really, we up until now haven't really explored towns and the role that towns play in housing provision. It has come into the language now, but I think we're still struggling with how to deal with that and how to deal with vacancy. We tend not to talk about what I've called here the triple bottom line, which is really sustainable development. There tends to be more of a focus on social and economics, not on the environment. We don't tend to talk about affordability because there seems to be this kind of othering of rural. Well, sure, it's cheaper, so move out. But actually, there's major affordability issues in rural areas, which we'll highlight later. Also, what role does housing have to play in low carbon transitions? Really just highlighting that fact that we need to start addressing environmental impacts of commuting and housing more and more. And also we tend to talk about wanting housing and a right to housing, but actually there is a housing need. Just as there's housing need around Dublin, there's housing need everywhere else. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes around the spatial, kind of understanding the spatial context for housing. And really, rather than having maps of housing here, what I have is a series of maps looking at some of the socioeconomic context for housing. So this first one is looking at the median annual household gross income by electorate division. This is 2016 data based on data from the census and revenue. In this map and the following maps, I've pulled out Ennistimon and Lahinch and Newtown and Kennedy. These are our study areas. And really this shows a generally unsurprising picture in the sense that, you know, higher incomes tend to be in the east and southwest around the larger urban centres. Lower incomes are more associated to the west and northwest and in more rural areas. Again, I don't think that's too much of a shocker, but it's really important to show the context of where those incomes are lying. And again, this is median gross. On the next slide, and for the next couple, I just have some maps here showing the main economic sectors that dominate in certain parts of the country. Again, unsurprisingly, ICT, scientific, recreation, this is the categories that we get them in. They're in higher levels in the East Coast, and then as we go west again, lower levels, particularly around ICT and scientific. Though of course there are pockets around the urban centres, like Galway would come to mind in particular as having a major scientific employment sector, and obviously recreation is more coastal. On the next map, we have public service, education and health. I always like to kind of show sort of something here that highlights the public sector, because it does show we always have higher percentage of the population working in public sector employment in rural areas and in the west and northwest. It shows the reliance for many households on public sector employment. And the final one of these ones is agriculture, because I suppose I can't talk about rural and not talk about agriculture, but actually what this really does show is that agriculture has really increasingly become less of a direct employer in rural areas, and it's showing a growing diversity of employment. But you know, it also kind of always highlights to me when we talk about planning and we talk about housing, farming and agriculture actually comes in there, but less and less of the population are working directly in farming. I have a couple of more slides now as well. So going back to commuting, we have here looking at median income per commuter travelling less than 30 minutes. So in some of the literature, and generally in the literature, we find that people who commute longer distances tend to have a higher income. And generally these maps, and because I will show you the more than 30 in a minute, these maps basically would stick with that. You'll see there in Ennistimon and Lahinch, they're in the kind of lower averages, and as you go further east, we're higher. But interestingly, where Newtown Mount Kennedy is located, relative to its surrounding electorate divisions, the income is lower. And I think that is quite interesting. And it kind of highlights a few things that I'll talk about in a minute about why people moved to Newtown. And the next slide shows the median income per commuter travelling greater than 30 minutes. Here you'll see there is an increase in income, but the similar trend there where Newtown Kennedy actually lower income than surrounding neighbours. So that again kind of highlights some of the findings in our study. And the final map then. Now this is a map that I think is very interesting. I'd be curious to hear what people think. So what we did, and this was based on a suggestion from a colleague, we were at the Conference of Irish Geographers last week, and a colleague from UCD, Niamh Moore-Cherry, suggested we look at this. So I have to give her a little acknowledgement here. This is a ratio of median household gross income to house price. And what we did was we pulled the COVID years. So we brought 2020 data, 2021, and what we have now up to 2022. So about 2.5 years of data. And we looked at affordability, basically. So in the yellows, any of the yellow areas are median income and housing is affordable. So now obviously this is averages and there's always going to be different outliers here, but this is just giving a general indication of affordability. So in the yellow areas, the ratio of income to house price is up to 3.5. And 3.5, of course, is the central bank affordability indicator for income. Anything outside of the yellow areas, so green to blue, is technically unaffordable. It is unaffordable on average to buy a house in these areas. You'll see there the greens. I have some of the percentages here. So 20% of the electoral divisions that we have data for could be considered affordable. In all the other electoral divisions, 20% of median income would find it unaffordable to buy a house in these areas. And that really, really is striking. So I kind of want to let you have a look at that for a minute, because I think there's a lot to kind of take in there, and it's sort of something we're developing ourselves as we go. You'll see in the study areas, both Ennistimon and Newtown Mount Kennedy, so very diverging areas, are both in the blues. And I can tell you that it would, in order on average to buy a house in Ennistimon, Lahinch, you would have to buy a house for 7.3 times your salary. In Newtown Mount Kennedy, it would be 7.6 times your salary. So while these are two very different places, there's actually a very similar ratio of household income to housing affordability. So I think it does give some insight there, and really reflects a lot of the lived experience of our respondents. So I know everyone wants to look at where their place is. So I can put it back up later. So Caroline, next slide. So when we looked, and the next slide, when we looked at lived experience, and I'll kind of try and go through this because I'm quite conscious of time, housing, homes came up a lot in our interviews. So housing and house, those kind of stemmed relation words, came up 105 times. Homes, home came up 129 times. And that's out of 19 interviews. And people talked about homes in relation to commuting, hours, planning, all that kind of language came up. And for housing, in the next slide, language around developments, local, trying to get the house, that kind of language came up. So then just looking at some of our interviews, for Ennistimon and Lahinch, we had some really interesting kind of interviews with people. So in this case, this was the case of somebody who had bought a house in Dublin, had renovated and had sold and moved to Ennistimon. And they were saying, we are renting a lovely house. Now it's not cheap, but you wouldn't get anything like this in Dublin. I did think I'd buy a nice house with a field for a horse or whatever, but actually in the meantime, property prices have gone very, very high here. They're still affordable, but the quality of housing and lack of builders to do it has been a major problem. And so that's really highlighting somebody who had moved for affordability, but was actually still struggling to get a house. And they talk later in the quote about houses going to 600,000 or 900,000. Next slide. In Lahinch then, we had a respondent who said, I didn't choose to actually live in Lahinch. It's not like I wanted to live there. I just wanted to have my own space again and move out of my parents' house. I've been asking friends, so I've been looking on Daft almost every day. Houses around here are very scarce. Like nearly everything that goes up on Daft is either in Ennis or Shannon. And again, it's this perception that we have that if you move out into rural areas, you can get a house, but actually there's major supply issues in rural areas. Going then to Newtown on the next slide, when we talked about housing, people were actually a little bit, while it's really interesting, while average salary ratio to house price is similar between the two study areas, there was this perception from the respondents that housing was more affordable. And it was really because they had moved from Dublin. So there was this, it was relative to Dublin, it was cheaper. And basically they talked more about the things surrounding that, like your train links, your access to facilities and services, but then worried about the amount of development. Like, so they say here, there's nobody designing a village centre. We don't have a central hub where people can gather, and there's no design for it. It's ad hoc development. Next slide. And this came up again in the surveys where really people were, while they were happy to be able to get their house, they were worried about traffic, and also talking about amenities for kids, for example, playground. So we finish up. I have a concluding slide here now. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm very, very conscious of time. So really this study, while we're still really exploring the findings from it, we really wanted to highlight that long distance commuting is driven by income and that travel cost trade-off. And obviously, and particularly we focused on this in this presentation, housing affordability is a major issue, and it's quite nuanced across Ireland and particularly outside of the major urban centres, which we associate with having housing problems. And obviously transport and connectivity came up. We know that commuting impacts negatively on subjective well-being, and we have other findings that are coming out on that. But it's really important to unpack that impact on community needs. So we really need to disentangle growth effects from commuting effects. So places that are growing, is it due to commuting? Is it due to other reasons? What are the commuter narratives telling us? And really, what's really important to us as geographers and planners is that we want to bring place to the centre of what our study is, that commuting really is having a significant impact on place. And COVID presented us with an opportunity to look at models of work and how we interact with place. So there's two things there: how will work change and how does that impact on place? And then we cannot forget all the other associated policies around housing, climate change and quality of life. And really, what's really coming out for us at the moment when we speak to our policymakers is really trying to look at the environmental impacts of commuting on both locally and globally. So thank you very much.
Karen and Caroline, thanks a million. There's just so much there, I think, for us to work with. Well done to both of you and the rest of your team on such a great piece of work and such an interesting piece of work. Everything from the commuting, you know, how COVID has impacted on that, to definitely the issues of housing. And I suppose we hear so often about housing in relation to urban development, but we hear very little in relation to rural. And we can see ourselves, I suppose, most of us living in rural settings, I suppose the scarcity of rural housing at the moment, the scarcity of renting housing. And then what you looked at in relation to the quality of life aspects of that and the commuting, and I suppose being one of those people that's over that 45 minutes commuting kind of times and distances, I was beginning to get a bit bothered there about some of those ideas in and around the effects of that long-term commuting. But definitely so much going on there, Karen. So I'm going to maybe open it to the floor. I definitely want people to put in, you know, comments there on the chat. But I think there's a group here who maybe somebody wants to come in fairly quickly in relation to some reaction, comments, or questions for Karen and Caroline. So I kind of think we could open the floor if you want to. Louise is coming in there fairly quickly.
Hi, a quick remark, amazing study. As Maura said, so much in there. And I just think we're at a crossroads actually in this country. And this is so timely for policy and even for ourselves at research, Karen and Caroline. You know, we talk about rural typologies. I think this is something we need to think about. The typologies we currently have, do they reflect the reality? I'm not too sure. That's probably another 3-hour discussion at least. You know, you mentioned things, and for policy especially, we talk, you looked at the work. I think that's really important. We did remote work in the ruralisation. It's the quality of jobs. I mean, if the ones that are travelling the furthest get the most pay, and I wonder how, and the reference points even to, you know, oh, it's cheap compared to Dublin. And we talk about, I think there's an amazing difference when you put up the regional points compared to the local on that slide, and talk about, we have the language from planning on growth centres, growth development models. And yet on the local side, we talk about sense of place and all the softer things. And I think there's an amazing mismatch between our theory and our reality of what we produce in our policy. I just wonder, what do you think, what might this say to policy? What do you feel is coming out?
I don't know who should take that. Caroline is the policy expert. I do agree with you. I think it's actually a really good point, Louise. Like, you know, we all know the theory of planning and completely understand that the growth centre model, but actually what matters for people locally can be different. And yet there has to be that top-down approach to an extent. But obviously, I think that's where, in ways, there's a lot of learning to be done from rural development, because community-led local development, while we talk about that obviously in a very socioeconomic manner, there's a lot to be said about, you know, people having more say in the planning process as well, but also understanding some of the issues. And I think what I've always felt, so with working on housing for quite a number of years, is this looking at housing in a vacuum, as if it was a sector, a silo, separate. And like we all, like a house is at the core actually of our lives. And in one sense, you know, the structural kind of problems that we have in Ireland at the moment are having such impacts on people's quality of life and the choices that people feel they have to make. You know, and that kind of cost payoff that we mentioned. So, and I do think there has been increasing efforts to look more holistically at planning. I think we do see it in the National Planning Framework. And even like at the end of this, some of our funders are the Office for Planning Regulator and Department of Housing. They do want to know what's happening, but possibly also with some of the politicization around these points, that there's a bit of a fear around touching rural housing. Like, I think I'm always double checking that I haven't missed that the housing guidelines have come out, but I think the last time, I think I would know though, the last time I checked there was an interview where it was meant to come out in February, you know. So I think I can understand why it's challenging to get it out there. But the irony is a lot of policies have probably already moved on locally around that anyway. Caroline probably has something more succinct to add, I don't know. No pressure.
Very little to add to that, but I suppose when we looked at COVID, you know, the narrative was that this had presented us with an opportunity to do things differently, to build back differently, and yet, you know, very quickly we seem to be heading back into old patterns and trends around commuting and back into the office. And so, you know, we risk kind of squandering the opportunity in some ways that COVID had presented to us. So, you know, part of this study is we are trying to just connect the dots between quite a various range of policies that are touching on commuting, the implications of commuting, but at the same time aren't speaking to each other holistically. And so we're trying through this study and particularly honing in on the commuter narratives and that experience of commuting and what that means for people and what people are, I suppose both gaining, but actually losing as well because of that, trying to pull all that out and feed that back into the policy loop and connect those dots. And that's why it's great in terms of our funders that we have some of those key bodies sitting at the table with us who we meet every 6 months or so and feed in what's coming out of the study. So come the end, there will be no surprises, no shocks. They're going to be fully aware of where this study is going and what our ask then of them is at the very end.
Great, Caroline, thanks for that. I see Steve Dolan from Galway Rural Development. Steve, you got your hand up there.
Thanks, Maura. Yeah, I'm actually thinking of something Shane said to me when we were over in Kilkenny. Is there an opportunity now with, like our rural future has been well received. A lot of meat needs to be added to the bones. But does that provide a vehicle now where people are a little bit more open? It doesn't go down the darker areas that are really, in a way, secondary to the bigger issues. And could it be used as a vehicle for you know, maybe addressing fears a little more calmly and a little less, you know, emotively, in terms of you know, transport and so on?
Karen and Caroline.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit, so I hope
Yes.
I got you were saying like using our rural future as a vehicle to kind of maybe even get that conversation going. I hope, Steve, I don't know if I'm answering you properly. I suppose, I know from my sense of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like, I know my sense when it comes
that's right.
to planning and housing sort of in rural towns and outer rural areas, in one sense, things have already changed. Like since the crash, you know, which kind of over 10 years ago now, there was obviously a major slowdown in housing. And in many ways, each local authority has taken their own approach. Like in a lot of local authorities now, there's, you know, they don't necessarily want people building in a green field, literally a green field site. You know, it's more, can we use of what's there? And while obviously not everybody is entirely happy with that, I do see a shift in people's attitudes. But I know from more like from the ruralization study, there is still a desire for young people to live in detached housing. I thought that was you know, I've seen you present on that. But, you know, definitely I think people are changing their approaches, like choices around, well, actually, can I live in a town and be able to walk to a coffee shop? Can I walk to a train station? Can I cycle? Because even with, I think, cost of fuel alone would make you sometimes go, will I take that journey? I'll be back again filling. So I do think there's a slow change. And actually, that's what I would feel, that in ways, I think the communities and the people living in rural areas are almost ahead of some of the politicians in their thinking, in the same way that people living in rural areas are very diverse and very open to environmental change, you know, to environmental you know, mitigation and all of those things. And so I think we do need to listen to people and bring people in more and not assume it's only the loudest voices that are actually representing the majority.
Great, Karen, thanks a million for that. I suppose myself, Karen, and maybe even Caroline, you know, I suppose looking at rural development and looking at community engagement in kind of developing rural areas, I've often found that commuting plays a huge negative role in allowing people that time to engage themselves in communities. And I suppose in the very initial stages of COVID, we did have that extra bit of a drive in relation to people trying to engage in their community and assist people via the COVID kind of aspect. But do you feel that we haven't fully capitalized on that in relation to community development and this idea that we may have that little bit more time for community engagement, but we're not fully engaging in the community either. I'm just wondering, Karen.
What we're starting to see in our survey responses is, while the literature tells us there is this impact of commuting on social capital, it's not overly evident in the towns that we're looking at and the responses we're starting to see. And from our analysis of the survey responses, a lot of that actually goes back to GA and that kind of unique structure that we have here in Ireland, across the island, whereby, you know, we have our clubs and it's the kids that really get you engaged. And I know here, living in rural Meath, with two small boys, you know, I'm on the clock when I'm in the office to get home, to get to training, and training is 4 nights a week because they're in different age categories. And so, and my husband trains 2 of the teams. So, you know, I think we're not seeing that as evident as actually the literature would have suggested to us that we were going to see. And I think sort of also in terms of COVID and that response to COVID, we're seeing a lot of the community groups actually indicating that they've seen a real revitalization of their structures, new membership coming in, and so far they're holding on to that, and they're looking then at new ways of keeping this new cohort involved in terms of then, you know, asking for their ideas of what they're interested in and how that can be harnessed to support the community. So it's quite an interesting kind of factor coming out in our research, that it is kind of going against almost what we expected to find. So we are now, through the focus groups, going to explore that a little bit further, and those focus groups haven't yet happened, but they are in train.
Great, Caroline, very good there, very good ideas. I might maybe just towards the end, I might maybe bring in Louise, maybe might just have a quick look at the chat. There's quite a number of comments coming in there.
Yes, thank you. Obviously, loads when you look over this, Karen, everyone is really interested. It's definitely ignited the whole group that's here and comes at their synergies with others. Brendan has just made a comment. Well, first, let me go back to Deirdre, who noted the discrepancy between the incomes on the house, the West, maybe the impact of the holiday homes and scenic areas. That's a whole other area I think you'll both agree that probably needs to be discussed as well. And Brendan just mentioned these kind of 2 sides of the coin, which is really insightful. Like for longer commutes, there are 2 very different perspectives. The person anchored to their work, first and foremost, they must find a place where to live, with price being a factor. And then on the other side, the person is anchored to where they wish to live and raise their families with deep commitment to it, and where they work is a matter of opportunity. So it's how do you reconcile that? Or do you think, is there any middle ground to try and, is remote work the answer to that, I wonder? Or are there any, is this an opportunity space, or have you identified anything maybe there?
Maybe a quick final comment maybe for Karen or Caroline in relation to any of those comments.
I thought Caroline's I was waiting for Karen. I do think, Brendan, that's a really good point, and that's what we are finding. There's a tendency, in Ireland, like it's very geographical, which obviously we love to see a pattern. The more rural and the more west you go, there's more likely to be a familial connection. And then within at the moment, and we will have another Greater Dublin study area next year, it tends to be more the price, the housing cost. So that both have impacts, because and I know myself, being based you know, in a rural town, that the return, like a rural place allowing, and I mean that in the sense of having the structures for people to return, is a very positive thing. And actually there's been, you know, the studies over the year. My late colleague Aileen Stockdale, I remember, had a fantastic paper from a number of years ago, which actually looked at the value of young people leaving but then returning, and that actually does bring social capital with it, in its, you know, but then not to forget the other impacts of potentially, you know, are they, you know, that there's only certain jobs that will be able to either work from home or commute with.
Great.
Thanks, Brendan.
Karen, thanks a lot for that. And I think at that, we're going to bring the session to a close. We like to kind of keep it fairly well on time when people have just the hour given to us. But we have some great comments in there, Karen and Caroline. It has been really insightful. I think you've really struck a chord. The whole commuting, the whole housing issue really has as much to bear on rural areas as it has on any urban centre. And I think really bringing your research to inform policy is definitely where we need to be. And I think it was one of our ideas right from the get-go with the rural voices ideas that we would bring the research that's being done to policymakers who may at times, try to bring policy over the line without it being informed by research, which is not a very good way to go about kind of maybe informing policy. So Karen and Caroline, definitely, I hope that your research really can inform kind of policy in and around rural commuting and rural housing. So to that, I would definitely thank you both most sincerely for informing us so well today in relation to your research. Just before I finish, I want to thank again, of course, the Department of Rural and Community Development, who are on the board with us in relation to the Rural Voices seminar. I want to thank Shane Conway in the background, who does a huge amount of work with putting this and pulling this all together via the Rural Studies Centre in NUI Galway. So Shane, thanks a million. As always, I want to thank Louise, who has so many insights herself in relation to particularly planning, which is her background, but also in relation to the chat that comes in and out. But to you who come in and out with us all of the time in relation to the seminar series, thank you so much. We're back again in June. We're going to take a little break in July and August, but we have another really good seminar coming up in June. So over the next couple of weeks, we'll start to disseminate that to you. And again, last Wednesday, 3 to 4 every month, we will be bringing the Rural Voices seminar series. So thanks a million for joining us. And most definitely thanks to Karen and Caroline for your great research. Thanks a million, everybody. Bye for now.